Welcome once again to the Ohio State of Mind, a show powered by Scarlet and Gray Sports Radio. Alongside Tyler Danburg, I'm Caleb Spinner. And Tyler, before we get started talking about women's basketball and women's volleyball, once again, we'll give our listeners an update. One show a week. It's on Fridays. This is the last week we'll do this because we've said it for the past 3 weeks, and from now on, we'll just get right into the content there. But we'll do one episode a week on Friday on the SGSR Podcast Network and Scarlet and Gray Sports Radio TV, using audiograms for now on our YouTube channel, but then we're planning on doing some video content down the road. And as well, we are no longer uploading to SoundCloud, so make sure you're checking our link tree in our bio on our social medias at State of Mind OSU on Twitter for that information. Then also get access to the entire SGSR Podcast Network via our link tree at our main Twitter, SGSR_OSU. But Tyler, let's start off with women's volleyball, which has been one of the better teams for Ohio State throughout this entire year. And I know we're barely even through the first semester, just ended a few weeks ago. So it's a bit early to say that, but you look at a team who's been ranked in the top 10 in every single poll of the season, finishing number 8 in the country. They had a really good end of the season, but they're going to get hit by some transfer portals. But first off, what do you think of the Ohio State women's volleyball team, the success that they've been able to have, and their disappointing but still impressive finish to the year?
Well, first off, the goal, Caleb, coming into this season, at the very least, was to make it past the Sweet 16, which Ohio State had reached the last 2 seasons. They did that, beating Minnesota. They fell to Texas, but they took a set against the Longhorns in the Elite Eight, and they made it there. The way that Ohio State's volleyball program has turned around the last couple of years has just been absolutely spectacular. So it's been really cool to see not only Ohio State have this program turn around under Jen Flynn Oldenburg, but to see campus, to see Columbus's reaction around this turnaround, the attendance rates going up, sellouts galore. It's been really cool to watch.
It's always amazing when the entire city and the campus gets behind a team that's maybe not as popular as football or men's basketball. You always like to see the support when, like you said, they're selling out those matches. I remember that opening set against Texas was packed, and part of that is to do with Texas being such a great team going on to win the national championship. But also part of that is the hype that this team has been generating. And when you get on a roll, you draw eyes. But you're going to lose a lot here if you're Ohio State women's volleyball over this upcoming offseason here. Janasia Moore, Mac Pedraza, Gabby Gonzalez, Kylie Murr, and Adira Powell have all entered the transfer portal. Powell has accepted a spot at Clemson, and there's no decision yet for Moore, Pedraza, Gonzalez, or Murr. But this isn't the first time, Tyler, even in our time here at Ohio State, in which the Buckeyes have had to regroup significant losses as a result of the portal. You remember last year having to fill the holes of Vanya Bukalik and Arica Davis, who went to NC State and Minnesota. So this is a very familiar challenge for Ohio State. But I want to ask you, because I know there's 2 ways that you can go here. You can either 1-to-1 replace these people. So let's say 1-to-1, for example, you lose an outside hitter, you go into a transfer portal and you look for an outside hitter, whether an incoming freshman, or somebody that you get in as a freshman signee, or you can decide to bump up somebody on your bench who plays outside hitter and bring in somebody else. So let's say there's a really good front middle that you want to do, a front blocker, bring them in, and you still have that depth then you use to fill in that outside hitter. So there's 2 different ways that I see Jen Flynn Oldenburg doing here. I don't think either one is worse off than the other. But it's just going to be something that you have to watch, is how Ohio State decides to recoup these losses.
I think it's going to be a little bit of a mix of both, Caleb. And again, we're not sure how Ohio State's going to attack this, because these 5 transfers, which basically made up most of the starting lineup, this has been a recent development as of the last week, besides Adria Powell, who even on her senior night, it was announced that she was going to be going to Clemson as a part of her graduate degree. But now you got to look and see how Ohio State attacks this. And we saw them bring in a lot of good recruits already. They're going to have a strong recruiting class coming in. Eloise Brandaway, a Bishop Hartley grad, she's going to be a middle blocker. Grace Egan, an outside hitter. Lauren Murphy, an outside hitter. She's 6'4", by the way. Mia Tuman, the setter. So we're going to see Ohio State, at least recruiting-wise, revamp their setters, get some outsides, and like you said, some help in the middle. Now, last year when the Buckeyes lost Bukalik and Davis, they didn't go to their transfer portal. They just went to recruiting, and they went to their bench. And that's how Adria Powell stepped up, because she had not played much 2 years ago. She gets the chance to play, and she leads the team in blocks. So maybe this is where we can see an Anna McClure or a Chelsea Thorpe step up. So there are a couple ways Jen Flynn Oldenburg can go about this. We'll see how she does it. But the Buckeyes are going to be bringing in a top recruiting class anyways, and I'm sure that's going to only keep building from there. By the way, this transfer portal situation, not sure if a team is going to get hit harder than Ohio State, but Jen Flynn Oldenburg, Mac Pedraza, they did a great interview with Volleyball Magazine, volleyballmag.com, talking about this transfer portal stuff. Cannot recommend it enough. If you're interested in learning more about it, well, you've got the head coach and one of Ohio State star players to talk things over.
Yeah, and I think this is obviously a bad situation where any way you slice it. But I think I'd be a bit worried from the perspective of an Ohio State fan if the Buckeyes hadn't faced this before, let alone faced this in the last 2 years. This is a very familiar challenge that Ohio State's going to face. It sounds like, from what you said, historically filling in those spots of Bukalik and Davis, that they're going to go to the bench primarily. Doesn't mean that there won't be somebody they probably take a look at in the transfer portal, but probably go to the bench. And I think that's what sets Ohio State apart from a lot of these different programs, is that you're able to train your replacements in-house. You've got Adria Powell on the bench who can come in and fill for Vanya Bukalik and play successfully. That's one thing to fill. It's another thing to step up and be a leader to the team, which you could argue she was, again, leading the team in blocks like you mentioned. So this is a big problem that they have, but it's not one that requires panic. It's not one that doesn't have an easily reachable solution, and it's not one they haven't seen before. So in that regard, I think that lowers the urgency or the worry that comes with having 5 players go to the transfer portal before this offseason.
Right. But the only thing, you're absolutely correct. And this season is a little bit different for Ohio State in the transfer portal because you happen to lose the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year and the Big Ten Setter of the Year. 2 of your biggest pieces in program history, especially over the last couple of years. So it's going to be interesting to see how Ohio State revamps what they lost in this offseason, especially coming off such a dominant regular and postseason.
As we go through our Ohio State athletic year, we'll keep an eye turned towards the portal and towards Ohio State women's volleyball and see what they're doing to recoup these losses and following along with some of their stories through the offseason. We won't be done talking about women's volleyball, I have a feeling, Tyler. They always find a way to make headlines. But let's switch over to another team that's been doing incredibly well, and that's Ohio State women's basketball. The number 3 Buckeyes secured 2 non-conference wins against South Florida, 88-86 in that first match in overtime, and then against Oregon yesterday, or 2 days ago rather, 84-67. Big game for Taylor Mikesell against the Ducks. She got to play against her old team for the first time since transferring to Ohio State. This was one that they were talking about in the press conferences 2 weeks ago, that they wanted a matchup just for Taylor against Oregon, and they seemed to do pretty well by that final margin. But the Buckeyes had a tough go of things in that opening game against South Florida. They needed overtime, as I said, to secure a win, and they're uncertain about Madison Green's status after she injured what looked to be her lower leg. I won't comment on which one because it's not familiar to me, and let's be honest, I'm not a doctor or anybody who's studied anything in college aside from my elementary biology class. But it's certainly something that you're going to want to keep an eye to, Tyler. She's filled in a lot of that spot, that starting role, since J.C. Sheldon has been out. And with it being a leg injury, you got to take a look at where it is in relation to the injury that sidelined her all of the season last year.
Madison Green has really stepped up this year, and she could be kind of that missing piece of the puzzle that was not there last year, and she completes it this year. She's the program's leader in minutes played right now, and she had a huge game in that matchup against South Florida. She also kind of completes that 3-guard lineup along with J.C. Sheldon, Taylor Mikesell when they're out there. But looking at that South Florida game, I think that's one of those games that you're going to look back at the end of the season and think that this could be a game that turns around or keeps the momentum of the entire season, because the Buckeyes, they had Madison Green go down. They didn't have J.C. Sheldon out there. Taylor Mikesell didn't hit a 3-pointer until overtime, yet they erased a double-digit deficit. They came back in overtime, and they won a game without one of their leaders, another one of their leaders and their point guard out with an injury at the end of the game, and one of their star players didn't really get going until overtime. So a really fascinating game if you go back and watch it, and one of those ones that will make you think that this Ohio State team much deeper than it was even realized.
And again, as we just talked about with women's volleyball, of course you don't want to lose some of your biggest players, but you have bench depth to fill it. I'm going to look at Ricky Harris to fill a lot of that guard play, maybe even taking over that starting role depending on how severe Madison Green is out and what Sheldon's situation is. But I wanted to talk to you about that. How especially urgent now for the Buckeyes is getting Sheldon back on the floor. Of course, you want her out there every minute of every game for the entire season. And no, not to say that Ohio State trainers are like holding off on her or anything, or not trying their best to get her out there. But how especially urgent if Green ends up being sidelined for a long period of time. I won't say the whole season, but even if she's out like 2 weeks, of course, Ricky Harris is a very capable guard, but you'll want Sheldon back out there as soon as possible.
I think you said it right there. The more Green is out, the more urgent it is for J.C. Sheldon to get back on the floor. Ricky Harris is a very capable guard. She can score, she can dish it out. She's also really good on the defensive side of the ball. So she adds another level to that Ohio State backcourt. But definitely having J.C. Sheldon back going into conference play, especially when Big Ten opponents really start to ramp it up, that's going to be crucial for Ohio State, getting Sheldon back out on the floor when Big Ten play returns.
That's something I'm glad you brought up, is the defensive strength. I feel like it gets overlooked a lot when you talk about a guard. Can they dribble? Can they shoot the three? I feel like those two things are more commonly talked about than their defensive ability. In hockey, what we would call on the back check, going back down the floor, trying to get back there and stop a fast break. But you talked about 2 Big Ten games coming up to finish this 2022 section of the year, at Northwestern next, and then home against Michigan on New Year's Eve. We have, of course, the things that we've talked about. One of the many things that we've talked about through the history of the show is the E+R=O mentality, event plus response equals outcome. You got 2 injuries that you can't control. You can never control when a player goes down. You can try your best to prevent injuries, but they're going to happen, try as you may to prevent them. But you can't control that. You can control the response to them. What things need to happen for Ohio State in order to carry momentum into the new year? Still being undefeated, knowing you're going to have a target on your back, knowing you're not at full strength in terms of health. What do you have to do to keep the Wolves off?
It's got to start with running the fast break. Ohio State, they play fast. They've got the top scoring offense in the Big Ten, one of the top scoring offenses in the country. They've also got an incredible scoring margin as well. They're beating teams by about 26.5 points at this point, and they get a lot of their points off turnovers and on the fast break. So if they're going to really want to set the tone against Northwestern, Michigan at the Cavelli Center rather than the Schottenstein Center, by the way, they're going to have to run the full court press. They're going to have to get points off turnovers and in transition.
That'll do it for us here on the Ohio State of Mind. Once again, make sure you're following both our Twitter and the SGSR main Twitter. Ours is State of Mind OSU, and the main Twitter, SGSR_OSU. But alongside Tyler Danburg, I'm Caleb Spinner. We'll see you next Friday. But for now, that's the show. We're out of here.